Hi everybody, today we're going to cover episode 7, Breaking the Law to Destroy Families. If you remember going back to episode 1 and 2, we talked about how just in the Pennington County court system in Rapid City between the years 2010 and 2013, it was discovered that 832 children had been unjustly removed from their parents' home, just American Indian children. This did not include anybody else. Now remember in episodes 1 through 3 how we have extensively established that the laws which govern the state of South Dakota, which every publicly appointed official and judge has to abide by, have been enacted by the people. And the people have specifically put into law that during a divorce proceeding, which is found in South Dakota Codified Law, Chapter 5-4, that each party may have their own separate house, and this separate house is not to be presumed that the other party can enter. The second thing is 25-4 Appendix -10. They've specifically said that with any divorce proceeding involving children, there is going to be court rules establishing standard guidelines to be used as a minimum for non-custodial parenting time in divorce. There are specific laws which deal with how a judge is allowed to exercise any authority over children. And the standard guidelines, which the people of South Dakota have enacted, said that with service of a summons, which is prior to this even going into court, a judge has to then make decisions if he has jurisdiction on the court record. But prior to that even happening, the people of South Dakota have made it very clear that the standard guidelines state nothing in the child's life is allowed to be changed prior to a court hearing. And it specifically says that any minor child of the marriage shall remain in the custody of the parent who has been the primary caregiver for the minor child for the majority of the time for the 12 months preceding the filing of the summons and complaint, unless the parents state otherwise. Otherwise, the way that the people of South Dakota made it is that a divorce is supposed to try to affect the child as least amount as possible, and that the child retains as much stability in their life as possible. So these are the laws which Judge Connolly is bound to abide by. And then remember case law. So the parenting guidelines and custody decisions are guided by Fustenberg versus Fustenberg, 1999, in South Dakota Supreme Court File 35. And again, this was a highly contested custody case, and it spells out the Fustenberg factors for parenting. And subsequently, every single custody case, a judge must refer to these factors in addition to the law. However, after a custody dispute begins, people always try to make themselves look the best that they can when they're under scrutiny, and the judge is specifically told he has to consider how the parents acted prior to there being any kind of legal involvement. Now, the parenting guidelines that are mandatory, and they're, as soon as the summons is served, they're served with the summons and their law. It states that specifically a parent shall not enter the residence of another parent except by express invitation. Remember episode 5 and episode 4, all of the extensive domestic violence and everything, where Tim, who lived in Montana, was coming to South Dakota and entering Rachel's house without her permission and abusing them. Now refer back to episodes 1, 2, and 3. Due process of law states that every single court case has to be preceded in a certain way, and custody and divorce proceedings must occur under a hearing for custody and divorce proceedings. They're not allowed to happen under a temporary protection order hearing. They have to be handled in the other court files. However, on March 23rd, under a temporary protection order, because remember, Tim had fractured Rachel's pelvis. She was suffering permanent medical damage. She requested a protection order because he refused to leave her house and he's harassing her daily. So this is when Judge Connolly takes Rachel's house away from her and gives it exclusively to Tim, even though he has a house in Montana, because remember, Tim has no residence in South Dakota. He was a Montana resident, illegally filing for divorce in South Dakota. And Judge Connolly takes control of Rachel's children and gives them to Timothy John Evans as well, even though right here in the transcripts it says Rachel's telling Judge Connolly, Your Honor, he hasn't had custody of the kids since they were born. And Judge Connolly's also giving Rachel's house away. So Judge Connolly's trying to figure out if he has jurisdiction over Rachel's children. And these are all pictures of Rachel's children and their family. They're cousins. They have been best friends since they were born. And so because of protection for minors, any person who's not Rachel's child, their faces have been glittered out just for privacy purposes. And the Judge Connolly's trying to determine if he has jurisdiction, and he says, well, is this their home state? I mean, have they lived in South Dakota the majority of their lives? And Rachel said, no, they're Montana residents. They've lived in Montana the majority of their life. They were all born in Montana. They'd only lived in South Dakota for 2 years at that point. And even when they're living with Rachel in the house in South Dakota, Rachel clearly stated on the record, in the last year, they have spent the majority of their time in Montana, because remember, Rachel had just completed a year of working in Montana, and also with my family, all of whom reside in Montana. And then Judge Connolly's like, oh wait, but have you initiated a divorce action in Montana? Rachel said no. Okay then. Judge Connolly decided he was going to violate the law that the people of South Dakota enacted and preside over a custody matter in a protection order hearing illegally anyways. So when Rachel was telling Judge Connolly that her children were extensively involved with her family in Montana during the time required to set jurisdiction over children, because remember, South Dakota court cannot have jurisdiction over Montana children, these are pictures of Rachel's children with their first cousins, all taken in Montana because all of Rachel's family lives in Montana. And this is just some of the cousins, the ones that are Rachel's children's age. Because Rachel's one of 10 children and she's one of the older ones, Rachel's kids are the same age as her brother and sister's kids. And they are, Rachel has the oldest grandson, or the oldest grandchild at all. But 2 of them are 6 weeks apart, and Rachel's daughter Rylan and her brother's oldest son are 2 months apart, and so the children have been best friends since birth. So the 2 that are 6 weeks apart are specifically these 2 little guys, and they literally have been best friends since birth. They act like they're twins. They're inseparable. These are just the pictures that are during 2017 to 2018 during the time in question when Judge Connolly is trying to separate them. So cousins truly do make the best friends, and these are just some more pictures. The people of South Dakota have spoken and said that children benefit from continued contact with all relatives on both sides of the family. Such relationships should be protected and encouraged. Now, Tim, if you refer back to the episode Who Was Timothy John Evans, he has no family. He has one sister who he doesn't talk to. They have been distant for ages. During the time of the divorce, she tried to come back in the picture to act like she's supportive just to help him get custody of the kids. She didn't even make a single entrance into the court files. He just simply referred to her, and that was it. And she tried to send Rachel's kids presents just to act like she's involved in the family. However, she doesn't visit them. Rachel stopped to visit. Her name's Tina. She lived in Oklahoma. So when Rachel went down to visit Rachel's family in Texas, she did stop in and see Aunt Tina just to keep Tina in the loop. Anyways, these are cousins in Montana again. and more cousins and Grandpa Louie. Now, Rachel's son's name is Louie, after Grandpa Louie, and the picture on the right was kind of funny because Louie, Rachel's son, has a very mischievous attitude, and he's always getting into trouble. He's a clown, so he's not getting into trouble. He's just obnoxiously annoying, funny at times, but he never gets in trouble because he always makes everybody around him laugh, if you know what kind of mischievous I'm talking about. Anyways, he decided he was going to be Grandpa Louie and get a mustache from icing. And the first time that Rachel's son Louie referred to himself as Grandpa, because he knew he was named after Grandpa Louie, was when he was about 2 years old. The people of South Dakota have also explicitly created a law that says when you are considering custody of children, you need to consider reporting abuse falsely or without good cause. And when determining the best interest of a child, the court must consider whether the person whose conduct is under review has ever attempted to influence a child custody hearing by falsely or without good cause reporting child abuse, and that the other person in question has committed sexual abuse, physical abuse, or abuse and neglect against the child or a sibling of the child. So remember that Rachel is a domestic violence survivor. I refuse to be called a victim because I am a survivor until this man actually kills me, and he will not stop trying. This was extensively testified to during both his protection order hearing and also the divorce hearing. So remember that it has been very much documented in court that Tim is a domestic abuser, and also Rachel has suffered permanent medical damage because of it, and it's verified through a surgery, it's verified through court records, police records, and also medical records. And then this was a fraction of what Judge Connolly had with Tim's testimony under oath, saying that Rachel was found to beat the kids. All the times that Tim had called the police officers to come arrest Rachel for child abuse, and they found that Rachel was innocent. And also the very first one that triggered this whole thing was on March 5th, 2018. Rachel requested Tim leave her residence. The police officers informed Rachel that even though that restraining order was in place saying that Tim was not allowed inside Rachel's residence, they legally had to have a protection order so that they could remove Tim from Rachel's residence. And that's when Rachel filed the protection order request, which resulted in the hearing, which occurred on March 23rd, which we just went through. So again, all of this was covered back in the previous episodes, and Dr. Carrie Scoville, Tim's psychologist, said that Tim had made allegations of Rachel abusing her children, including grabbing Jansen, her son, by the neck and leaving a big red mark on the arm. He made allegations about Rachel spanking the kids, and Judge Connolly granted the interim use of Rachel's home to Tim while these child abuse investigations or allegations were investigated, and Case and Brown found out that they were false. Again, all this is recap from the previous episodes. It is recommended that you watch them in order just because of this reason, but Case and Brown, the licensed clinical social worker, performed an extensive investigation into Tim's abuse allegations and found that not only did the children deny them, but not a single other person could validate Tim's allegations, and that all of Tim's allegations were false. Case and Brown also found that there was zero reason to question Rachel's education of her children. Her oldest son tested in the top 5% of the nation through the testing administered by Rapid City area schools, and her daughter was just very shortly behind her son. And the other two boys were not old enough to be tested. Again, a judge has to take into consideration national standards, and these are all of the states that have laws regarding false reporting of abuse during custody allegations, and 100% of it was found to be false. Judge Connolly was required by law to take all of this into consideration and not grant Timothy John Evans custody. Now, that's not what Judge Connolly did. He promptly took custody away from Rachel, even though she was the only custodian of her children since they were born. Tim came in on the picture very sporadically, and Rachel had a gal in Rapid City who would help Rachel out while she was at work and take care of the children when they were not in school. And Rachel had not used this daycare provider for a year because she was exclusively taking care of her children. She brought them to Montana where she worked, and she had people in Montana who took care of them. And at the time of this March 23rd hearing, Rachel was no longer employed because she was no longer working in Montana. So now Rachel is off work 100% of the time. There's zero reason to be in daycare. And the people of South Dakota have said in the standard parenting guidelines under section 4.16 that when parents reside in the same community, they should use the same provider. However, the parents should have each other care for the children when the other parent is unavailable. So even though Judge Connolly gave Tim interim custody, Rachel was, by the extent of the law, and Judge Connolly had not overturned the standard parenting guidelines, she was, by the people of South Dakota, supposed to take care of her children when Tim was working. And now Tim is trying to act like he's this amazing guy. However, he puts the kids in daycare nonstop and refuses to allow Rachel custody. So what's Tim doing? Well, again, this is the people of South Dakota enacted a law on the left, and it's chapter 25-4-56, that says that when one of the parents has a history of domestic abuse, they're not supposed to have primary custody of the kids. In court, Judge Connolly gave Tim custody, knowing he had a history of domestic abuse. And now on the right is the power and control wheel, which I've shown all along that justice in South Dakota is simply who pays the judge the most money and white privileged males. If you are a person of color or an ethnic minority group or anything else, you get your children taken away from you for daring to say anything. And it all goes back to this power and control wheel where they are using children to abuse you. They're taking your economic abuse away and everything else. So remember the Feustenberg factors, and remember Tim's Mr. Jeffrey Haskell. Remember, if you look at who was Timothy John Evans in episode 5 and episode 6, Jeff Haskell admitted he's Tim's mistress. Well, this was during the divorce trial in November of 2018, and Jeff is being examined by Tim's attorney, Mitch Johnson, and Mitch is trying to prove that even though Tim has zero history of being able to take care of the kids, not a single picture could be found of Tim spending time with Rachel's 4 children without Rachel present until after the divorce proceedings were underway. So Mitch Johnson's asking Jeff, what does Tim do with his kids? And Jeff flat out says, well, more recently, he's been doing stuff with the kids. He likes to take them snowmobiling and dirt biking. And again, if you refer back to episode 4, Tim didn't purchase any snowmobiles until October 2017. And then if you go back and look at the invoices, those Arctic cats were so powerful that Rachel's kids couldn't really ride them. How could Tim be taking Rachel's kids snowmobiling on Arctic cats that he didn't purchase until the time of the divorce proceedings were almost underway? He'd already contemplated it. So again, custody was determined based on an affair in the marriage and personal vendetta against Rachel. So here's the case law again. Rachel's 4 children. Feustenberg versus Feustenberg. After a custody dispute begins, some contestants try to make themselves appear as good as possible, but the trial court must consider who was more devoted to the child when there was no court to impress. And in the previous episodes, Rachel's submitted pictures and tons of testimony about what has occurred with the children, what all happened with them, that Rachel did with them without Tim being present, and he showed up occasionally. Again, the people of South Dakota have spoken, and it is the law, South Dakota Codified Law 25-4-45, that when you're awarding the custody of a child, The court shall be guided by consideration of what appears to be for the best interest of the child. And they take into account the child's medical, the child's educational, the child's emotional, and mental well-being. So it was extensively proven in court on transcripts that Tim couldn't even list the children's medical conditions. He couldn't list if they had any drug allergies or not. He specifically wrote down none on when the one time that he did try to, because Rachel took the kids for all of their medical appointments, which we'll examine in the upcoming ones. She's the one who paid 100% for their glasses, their contacts, because Tim refused, their asthma, their well child's, their dental, their everything, their counseling. And Tim couldn't do any of that. So he, for the sake of trying to look like he was a dad who cared, took his oldest child, or his oldest child, I'll just say that, into a clinic that had no previous history of ever seeing Rachel's son before. And just to hurry quick, get a sports physical after Rachel had already turned the kids' sports physicals into the school system for the year. And he specifically said that they had no allergies, which Jansen has a life-threatening allergy to a certain medication. And the judge was fully aware and still ignored this fact. So also in the court records, Tim has refused to allow Rachel's children to have anything to do with their maternal grandparents. You will remember, if you watch the previous episodes, that Tim was adopted, and his adopted mother was older than any of Rachel's grandparents. And she did pass away. Grandma Judy passed away during this divorce proceeding. And so Tim did take Rachel's children to see Grandma Judy once in the hospital and then to her funeral. But he has refused to allow Rachel's children to have anything to do with their maternal grandparents and great-grandparents since the divorce proceeding began. And in the far left-hand picture is Rachel's father's parents, and they had a 70th anniversary party. Tim's refused to let the kids go to that. On the far right-hand side is after Rachel's grandma passed away in Texas from Alzheimer's. Her grandpa did remarry, and Rachel had to get a court order allowing her to take her children to Texas to her grandparents' wedding. During a holiday that she already had custody of her children, Tim was refusing to allow it to occur. And since 2020, Tim has refused 100% of interaction with Rachel and any of her family, except he came to Montana in July 2023, the end of July, just to get pictures with two of Rachel's siblings for court purposes, because he knows that this is coming up against him. Most interesting, Rachel's parents, who are in the very middle there, have stopped in Rapid City multiple times with the express purpose of seeing Rachel's children. And Tim's attorney, Mitch Johnson, and then also now there's a Gary Jensen attorney involved. They have completely prohibited allowing Rachel's children to have any interaction with Rachel's parents. Why? Because when Judge Connolly kicked Rachel out of her house, she moved in with her parents. She wound up having an apartment or a condo for a couple months until she had no income, and she's living on state assistance while she's going to college to get a degree. And she moved in with her parents. Rachel's mom helped out for 9 months with childcare and everything else. So Tim has refused to allow Rachel's family to have anything to do with her kids. And specifically, in March 2023, Rachel's mother was in the ICU for 3 weeks. She was not expected to live another day, and she was in very critical condition. And the doctors had all the family come home to say goodbye and prepare for a funeral. And Rachel's grandpa flew up from Texas, her mother's father, to say goodbye. All of her siblings came from out of state. Tim expressly refused to allow Rachel's children to come visit their grandma on her deathbed. And to this date, he drove within a half hour of where Rachel's parents live in July 2023 and refused to allow Rachel's children to see her own parents. Again, Kristi Noem was elected by the people of South Dakota to do a job, and that was to uphold the laws of the state and enacted by the people that she was elected to govern. It is her responsibility to oversee the faithful execution of the law by all judges without respect to any person. It should be based on the character and the actions of the person in question, not determined by your social status, your skin color, your religious affiliation, your sexual beliefs, anything like that. You are, by the Constitution of the United States and of South Dakota, all people are equal. And so Governor Kristi Noem has a duty, when she is made aware of these, to take action against the judges that she has put into office and continues to hold in office. And Governor Noem is very aware of what is going on with the judicial system and continues to turn her back and condone these. And so I'm calling all the people of South Dakota to hold the publicly elected officials accountable for the laws that the people have enacted. In the upcoming presentations, we're going to cover how the Pennington County Law Enforcement Department is guilty and what they do to turn their back if a police officer commits a crime and how they hide it. We're going to see how deep the corruption runs, and specifically Mitch Johnson, Tim's attorney. We're going to look at Daniel Lewis. He currently is a sheriff investigator for Pennington County. And we're going to look at the district attorney's office and then how the Supreme Court rules on all these matters and condones the illegal behavior, refuses to uphold the law, and turns their back.